On October the 31st, 1517, Martin Luther posted 95 big questions which he believed faced the church of his day to a local church door in Wittenberg, Germany. 500 years later, I decided to post 95 new questions, one a week, to the web, questions which I believe the church must face in the 21st century. Welcome back to Chalke Talk after the August break. I've come to believe that the pursuit of happiness as an end in itself will always let us down. It's only ever a deep sense of purpose and meaning that has the power to sustain us, to pull us through, any of us, over the long haul of life. Why? Because there are lots of times, countless times in our lives when we are just not happy. So in the end, I think it's impossible to thrive until we find answers to life's meaning-giving questions. Why am I here? And what kind of person do I want to become? I remember sitting chatting over a cup of coffee a few years back to a senior representative of the British establishment. We talked for a little while about his life. He'd enjoyed the privilege of being educated at one of Britain's most prestigious public schools and then one of its oldest and finest universities. Now, 2 decades later, he held an extremely influential position professionally, and he'd come to see me to discuss a new initiative for which he'd just been made responsible, developing a national scheme for mentoring young people into excellence. He asked my view. The primary question I suggested for a mentoring course for young people, or for any people for that matter, is not about the kind of job you're looking for, as important as that question is. It's about something much deeper. What kind of person are you becoming while you're doing it? It's a question of your vision for being human. A question about your character as well as your career. A good sense of vision and purpose creates a clear sense of responsibility, whereas the goal of happiness leaves you more worried about your rights and privileges, your salary and house, than any contribution you bring to others. My visitor looked shocked. He paused before hesitatingly explaining that throughout his education and subsequent career, he'd never been questioned about this. He'd had endless careers advice and careers sessions where he'd been asked about his professional ambitions as well as his aspirations around salary and lifestyle, but he said not once had he ever been confronted with life's primary question: what kind of person do you want to become? Central to the search for meaning is the story about one of the confrontations Jesus had with some of the religious leaders of his day, which is told in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 22. It explains that the Pharisees got together and that one of them, an expert in the Old Testament law, tested Jesus with a question. By the way, this legal guy must have been really something very special, something else, because even the average Pharisee was like a walking Hebrew Bible dictionary. Anyway, back to his question. Teacher, he asked, which is the greatest commandment in the law? Jesus' reply is very well known. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind, he said. This is the first and the greatest commandment. And the second is just like it. Love your neighbour as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these 2 commandments. In other words, Jesus is saying, love God, love others as yourself. That's it. That's what it means to be fully alive. All the rest is just window dressing. Every religious rule and precept beyond that is really only an attempt, some better than others, to contextualize to the best of the author's culturally bound understanding what love looks like in practice. But the problem was that neither of these two commandments chosen by Jesus was actually a command from the Hebrew Bible at all. Though he was aware that there were 10 perfectly good ones to choose from, he did an extraordinary thing. He ignored them all and he came up with something else. The first of Jesus' two innovative principles was taken from Deuteronomy, chapter 6, verse 5, the chapter after the 10 Commandments, and the second from another book of the Hebrew Bible altogether, the book of Leviticus. Jesus, of course, had track record in ignoring texts from the Hebrew scriptures, and sometimes he even openly contradicted them. For a start, he really didn't like anything that was violent, punitive, or exclusionary. So, just for instance, he never ever quotes from the book of Numbers, which is thoroughly legalistic, or from the books of Joshua or Judges, which are packed with violence, all supposedly committed in the name of and at the request of God. And here, he's just as discriminating. He ignores the long list of thou shalt nots in Leviticus chapters 18 through to 20, but instead plucks from the middle of it all a very rare positive statement. Leviticus chapter 19, verse 18, you must love your neighbour as you love yourself. The Pharisees were shocked, but over the centuries since, in the traditions of many contemplative strands of the Christian faith, Jesus' two great principles, love God and love others the way you love yourself, have been read and reflected on as the basis, the foundation of all his teaching. And also, surprisingly, they've been read backwards. Let me explain. From early Eastern church leaders like Clement of Alexandria and Origen in the 2nd century, and those we know as the Desert Fathers, the early Christian hermits who chose to live in the Egyptian desert beginning in the 3rd century, to people like Benedict, the founder of the Benedictine monks in the 5th century, and 1,000 years or more later, Ignatius Loyola, the Spanish priest who founded the Society of Jesus, better known to us as the Jesuits. They all started exploring what it means to love yourself before going on to then reflect on the practice of loving others and finally moving on to loving God. And for me, I'm convinced that these core principles from Jesus form a pretty good guide to answering those big questions. So over the coming weeks, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at with Chalke Talk. Learning to love ourselves, loving others, and loving God. But for now, I leave you with these questions. Why do you think that Jesus chose to answer the Pharisees' question to him without any reference to any of the existing commandments? What do you think that this means for rules-based approaches to life? And lastly, why are you here? And what kind of person are you trying to become? See you next week. Find more of my 95 questions at openchurch.network/chalktalk.